men fall with the battle cry. Tears fill the eyes of their loved ones and their brothers in arms. So it went for Joseph Warren. It should have been different, it could have been easy. His rank could have saved him, but a country unborn is bravery, and it spread like wildfire.
My name is Christian Despina, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Katie Turner-Getty, a writer, speaker, and researcher of early American history, as well as a frequent contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution. Katie, would you please introduce us to today's guest?
Thank you, Christian. I would be happy to. Today, we are so pleased to welcome Edith Steblecki. She is the curator and assistant director of the Paul Revere House, and also the author of the book, Paul Revere and Freemasonry. I cannot think of anyone that we would like to speak with more when it comes to Paul Revere. Edith, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Edith, I have to say, I'm so happy when you agreed to join us, because when I met you at the Paul Revere House, your passion, your exuberance for what you do was so inspiring. And it almost felt like I was in your home and you were giving me a house tour. So I guess let's start by asking, like, what made you become interested in curatorial studies, and what brought you to the Paul Revere House?
I have to say that my background is really just in general American history, not specifically in curatorial studies. I mean, I did a master's in history and a certificate in museum studies. So that kind of covered, a multitude of things. But so I kind of fell into the curatorial angle in a way.
And how'd you hook up with the Paul Revere House? How did that come about?
Actually, when I was at the University of Delaware, I met Patricia Sullivan, who became the director of the Paul Revere House. So when I found myself at loose ends, I contacted her and said, have you heard of any jobs? And she said, yes, I happen to have one if you're willing to move to Boston. So, and I was in New Jersey, at the time.
Right.
So that was quite fortuitous.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, you are the longest tenured person at the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Am I correct in that?
Yes, I've been there since 1983.
Okay, so you know where all the bodies are buried, all the secrets are.
I'm not saying.
All right, we'll
Good
wait till
answer.
we'll wait till we stop recording, and then I'll ask you that. But let me ask you, this question: what's the difference between a curator and a conservator?
Well, a curator studies objects, in my mind, and a conservator repairs them. We don't have an in-house conservation lab. So if we want to, I would not repair a newspaper myself. I guess maybe some curators are trained, pick up some training to be able to do basic repair tasks, but we don't do that in-house. If we have something that needs to be conserved, say like a newspaper is torn, we would take it to the Northeast Document Conservation Center, where they have, fully trained conservators who work in books, paper, photographs, all different kinds of things. So for us, it's a very big distinction. If we want a conservator, we seek one out, like a furniture conservator, or we have someone who looks at our clocks, from time to time, and that's not something that I would do. Yeah.
Edith, speaking of all of these very precious objects, can you tell us a little bit about what is in the Paul Revere Memorial Association collection? And a question I always love to ask curators and other museum professionals that we might be speaking with is, what are some of your favorite artifacts within the collection?
Well, our collection was created when the Paul Revere House was set up as a museum. So they did envision it being a historic house museum with Revere artifacts. So right off the bat, we had furniture. We don't have any accession book from 1908, so we don't know where all these objects came from, except our bed in has a plaque on it that says gift of the Tea Party chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So that we know. But the collection sort of grew, I guess, as they needed things. They wanted a clock, so we have a reference in some letters that they were looking to acquire a tall case clock. So the furniture is the main public thing, that is on display all the time. And this is in the two houses, because we also have the Hitchborn house next door, which we acquired in 1970, and it was restored in 1950. So that had furniture. So that's a chunk of it. But I mean, there's a lot of different things in the collection. I mean, of course, the heart of the collection is the Revere items. That would be anything made, owned, used by Revere, by anyone in his family. Like we have a ring that has a story of belonging to Rachel, the second wife. Copper spikes he made in his foundry. Engravings that prints of a copperplate engravings that he did. So we have a core of things that I would consider sort of Revere items. That's probably, as I said, kind of the heart of the collection. However, though, we have other things in the collection. We have probably over 400 postcards. Some of them are duplicates, but they're pictures of the exterior of the house, of the interior. There was a run of postcards in 1908 done by the Paul Revere Memorial Association. And those you very rarely see, but there are others from 1909 that you see over and over again, so we have different versions of some of these. I mean, in last year, for example, we picked up a postcard of the exterior of the house, just probably one that we already have. But on the bottom, it says 30 minutes drive from New England Sanitarium and Hospital, Stoneham. I mean,
Oh,
it's
wow.
the last thing you expect to see on the front of a postcard showing
Right.
the warehouse.
Right.
And some of the other postcards have Foster's picture frames stamped on the front, or McPhail's piano company. So I guess businesses would use these as advertising pieces, and stamp their name on it, because you did
how
have a
interesting.
very big postcard craze, in the 1890s and into the early 1900s. Newspapers, this I would consider within our Revere-related objects. If a newspaper has an advertisement for Revere's Foundry and we have the opportunity to buy it, we'll add that to the collection. So we do have paper things, some books in the collection, and of course some accessories. I mean, kitchen pots and pans and pokers and candlesticks, and we don't have a lot of house accessories. And we could have more, I suppose. When they first restored the house, people would walk into the rooms, and sort of like in the front room that you entered, they would go around a table. They were on these rubber runners. So people were so close to the objects that I don't think they had a lot of accessories in the house. At least from what it looks like from the postcards. The postcards actually are some of our only pictures of the interior, in the early 20th century, and in the mid 20th century. I wish there were more from that era, actually. So it's really useful in that way. But we have ride memorabilia, what I would consider ride memorabilia. Paul Revere crayons, Paul Revere Rubber Company, Paul Revere cigarettes.
Oh,
Which is so
wow.
odd. Someone mailed them to us from South Africa. They were made in South Africa by the American Cigarette Company. And the man who asked me about it he was a visitor to the house. He was so surprised that they didn't sell them here. And so I said to him, well, would you mail me a pack? And when he got home, he did. So we have that in the collection. That, so kind of odd things like that. One item that someone on the staff here will mention it sometimes, so I guess it's one of her favorite items, is a key that we got in 1998, I guess. And what it was a key supposedly to the front door of the Revere House. Hard to tell because the lock probably isn't the same. But this man contacted us and said, you know, my uncle very much got this key and very much wanted to return it to the Revere House because it belonged to the Revere House. And he had written a note attached to the key, and it said, I should not have done it, but I stole this key from Paul Revere's home in Boston, Massachusetts in 1919. And on the reverse, he says, during the Boston, Massachusetts police strike of 1919. So
How about that?
it was such an odd
That's
thing, you know, there was no mention in our annual minutes that they hired someone to, because he, I guess, he said he was a Marine. The man said his uncle had been a Marine and felt so badly that he had never returned the key that he wanted, the nephew who contacted us wanted to return it on behalf of his uncle, who never had the chance to return it. Whether the Revere House actually had someone sort of minding the house during the police strike, because there was some unrest, I guess, not necessarily in the North End, but in like Scully Square and other parts of Boston. But that was such a fun item. And when we would have it on display every once in a while, visitors would always chuckle about it. You know, they'd read the guy's note, and it's just so, you know, it's just so human, you know, to say I shouldn't have done it, but you know, this is
it really is.
another
Wow.
key that we have that I think is rather poignant is connected to the Great Boston Fire of 1872. And we got it from our president of our board, Paul Revere Jr. And what it was a key to the offices in Boston. And John Revere, who was running the company then, you know, the family was waiting and waiting to see, you know, whether the works down there would survive. And he returned home, and his daughter Grace recorded that he held up a set of keys and said, this is all that is left of our Kilby Street store. And he sort of tossed them on the table. So
Wow.
it's, you know, it's sad. It's, but someone kept those keys, and we have them in the collection now. So a lot of different stories like that. We do have, I mean, in terms of favorite objects, that precious object that I mentioned driving up to Andover is a Bible that we got last year. And it actually belonged to Paul Revere. And it was given to his daughter Harriet. And we got it through a family member. It passed down in the Burke family from the Reveres to Reynolds to Burkes. And when the man had died, his widow gave us the Bible. Interestingly, they first offered it to the Massachusetts Historical Society because they have the Revere family papers. So it would have been pertinent to their holdings. But as you can imagine, the Historical Society cannot accept every Bible that a
Right.
family walks in there with. So it was actually their policy not to accept Bibles. So they referred them to us. And we were, you know, very pleased to accept it, and they were pleased to have us have it. The thing about this Bible is that on the back of in the middle, on the back of the starting page for the New Testament, there's a manuscript written by Revere in his handwriting, and it's all of his children. It lists all of his children and when they were born, and many of them actually when they died. Because so many, when he died, only 5 of his 16 children were still alive. You know, so he was able to fill in the death date. But the interesting thing is that there was always been some confusion as to when he was born. Some people said January 1. There was an issue with old calendar, new calendar.
Right.
You know, some places say December 21, and here in writing on this document, which I thought I had a copy of here. Oh, he says right at the top, he says, Paul Revere, born in Boston, New England, December 21, 1764. So, because I think maybe they knew a baptism date, but not a birth date.
Right.
So it says definitively that according to Revere, you know, new calendar or old calendar aside, he would have celebrated his birthday on the 21st.
21st.
So
Yeah.
that was quite a nice thing to clear up.
Right. It's amazing. I can't believe you're talking about talking about everything from cigarette packs to keys. It's unbelievable.
Edith, speaking of other institutions like Mass Historical Society, do you ever loan out items from the collection to other institutions, or do you ever receive items on loan?
We do. Back in 1988, the Paul Revere Memorial Association wanted to do sort of a big exhibit about Revere's life. Now, of course, there's no place at the Revere House to do that. So we did that in cooperation with the National Heritage Museum in Lexington, and that was up for a year. So we had, a ton of our stuff in there, and also things borrowed from other museums. A lot of silver, in fact, that was borrowed from everywhere. But the Brandywine River Museum did an exhibit, Revere's Ride in Longfellow's Legend, and we gave them probably at least 20 things. I mean, it was, a big plaque that was done around in the 1890s, one of these plaster relief plaques showing Revere's Ride. They borrowed that. They borrowed some postcards and probably one or two, prints. So we were very happy to be asked to participate in that exhibit, and also very recently there was an exhibit Beyond Midnight, Paul Revere, and that was organized by the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and it had several venues, and we loaned a Revere mortar, like a little cannon, and a small engraved portrait we have of Revere that was done by the artist St. Memon when Revere was 65. And we have a calipers signed with Revere's name on it, and they borrowed that. And we have a piece of copper sheet that supposedly was on a church here, the roof of a church here in Boston, because of course Revere started rolling copper in the very early, 1800s at his mill in Canton. So they borrowed those 4 items. We're also part of the House Museum Alliance of Downtown Boston. And that's the Otis House, the Prescott House, us, the Nichols House, and the Gibson House. It's sort of a loose alliance, so we maybe do some joint programming and publicity. But we did an exhibit actually in Suffolk University Law School Gallery right on Tremont Street. And it was just an exhibit that highlighted the histories of the 4 houses. So that was nice. That was in 2002. And we had, I think, 17 items in there. We would do a small exhibit in Doric Hall in the new State House every year, because they have those cases where the visitors gather, to have a tour. And for many years, we would put a small exhibit in there in April and May. Oh, and the museum in Washington, D.C., they actually asked if they could borrow our eyeglasses. We have a pair of eyeglasses that have a tradition of belonging to Revere. And I guess they wanted to have Revere in their, exhibition, because the whole museum, I guess, is about news and the development of news. And he carried news to Lexington. So they wanted an artifact to represent him. And that's what they asked to borrow. So we said, sure. They borrowed it twice, actually, at 2 different times. Those have a little bit of a story. Supposedly they were left behind by Revere at a fire insurance company meeting that he was on the board of, or he was a member of. And he supposedly left them behind. And then in this insurance company, they had them on a shelf in the boardroom with a little tag on them, I guess, saying they were Revere's. And when the Great Fire of 1872 put the company out of business, someone who worked there sort of kind of asked if he could take them, and a descendant of that man offered it to us. I think he said he offered it to another Boston museum first, who turned them down, because I guess, there's no way to prove. That's the thing about a lot of these items. There's no way to prove or disprove, that the well-known person owned them, of its family tradition. But we were happy to accept them, and we just present the story, as we got it. It's certainly possible. but nice old, glasses with a case.
Right.
We would
You know,
consider that one of our Revere objects,
You talked about Revere carrying papers to Lexington, and this is what I've been really looking forward to asking you about, this rumblings of a lost letter that Revere had written right after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Can you shed some light on this?
Yes, I can. This is something that we're very, very, very pleased to now own. We would consider it the lost letter. It was a letter from Paul Revere to his wife, Rachel, and it was written probably in late April or approximately. It didn't have a date on it. I think it just said Charlestown. And it was written to my dear girl. That's the way it was started. And it ended, your loving father, PR. So a family descendant did have this letter. Nobody knew that this descendant had the letter. The Massachusetts Historical Society had maybe 3 or 4 letters back and forth at this time, right after the ride between Paul and Rachel, but this letter was missing. And this letter had been transcribed and was printed in the first biography of Revere that appeared in around 1890 by E.H. Goss. And Goss, I think, says in his notes that it belonged to the Revere family in Canton, descendants of John Revere. But since then, nobody knew what happened to the letter. And our education staff here at the house developed a program where the students would look at a few primary source documents. And they very much wanted to use this letter because Revere is saying to his wife, pack up, well, he says, what does he say? About her getting a pass to leave Boston. He could not return to Boston because he might be arrested. But the family, was one of many refugee families that tried to leave Boston. You had to get a pass from the British, officers to leave. And he's saying in the letter, I would have you get a pass for yourself and children and effects. Send the most valuable first. I mean that you should send beds enough for yourself and children, my chest, your trunk, with books, clothes, etc. To the ferry, tell the ferryman that they are mine. And he goes on, in this manner. And at the bottom, though, he has a postscript to the son. And he had this 15-year-old son named Paul. And he says to Paul, my son, it is now in your power to be serviceable to me, your mother, and yourself. I beg you will keep yourself at home or where your mother sends you. Don't come away till I send you word. When you bring anything to the ferry, tell them it's mine, mark it with my name. So that's why it's signed your loving father. So I think the man who had it knew it was a letter written by Revere, but thought it was written to Revere, from Revere to his daughter. He didn't know when it was written and, didn't know that it was to Rachel. We did take the document to the Northeast Document Conservation Center. The letter had been backed by some kind of linen or paper, and when they removed that, then they could see Rachel's name on the back. The way they had folded the letter, and there was just a little square on the back, and it said, Rachel Revere, Boston. So that made it very clear, that the letter was actually to Rachel. But there's so few personal letters from Revere. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't keep a line a day almanac. We don't have anything in writing where he says, oh, I just bought this big old house, or this is, we just bought bedding for the, someone like, say, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson have these copious records of how they furnished their houses. And for Revere, there really is nothing. And so even to hear him say, my chunk in your chest was an interesting reference, because we don't have any kind of references like that from Revere, which is unfortunate, but did have the opportunity to purchase the letter, and it's a very, very special letter to us. And we're very pleased to have it.
Yeah.
That was 2014, we acquired that.
Wow. Very
Well,
special.
so that was only what, 5-6 years ago.
Right, that's right. And I know the man who owned it was someone who our director Nina Zinieri had some contact with. He was a direct descendant. And for some, he must have mentioned he had some Revere items, and Nina said, well, if you were willing, bring them over. So he handed her this letter, and she opened it and looked at the letter, and she almost fell off her chair. I mean, she was,
Yeah.
and then she said, hold on a minute. And she left her desk and went to find the text of the letter. Because before she said anything, she wanted to make sure this really is the My Dear Girl letter. This really is the lost letter.
Wow.
And she had it there in her hands. So it was,
Wow.
it was
That's
really
incredible.
quite a thing, to finally have figured out, where
Right.
the letter was, and the Revere descendant, he had it all the time.
It's just amazing how even as late as, 2014, something like that can walk right through the door. It's really incredible.
This institution always had, they acquired some Revere items when we first opened. They had a Revere letter. They had some Revere engravings, and they had them mounted in the back room of the Revere House on the second floor. So they always conceived of the place as not only a historic house museum, but a place that would exhibit Revere artifacts. So from time to time, we've had cases in the Revere House, to show some of these things that we have that we don't have any place to show. So we've done these small exhibitions just on site, really to highlight things from our own collection. Only very rarely have we borrowed items from other places to exhibit here, because we had enough of our own. I did an exhibit once on postcards, on books, on just a lot of different things, to show, on toys, to showcase some of these things that we have. But we did borrow, in the 1980s, we borrowed some silver, one spoon, and a copy of the Liberty Bowl from the Museum of Fine Arts, because we didn't own any silver. There's so much silver at the Museum of Fine Arts that
Right.
the Paul Revere Memorial Association didn't really see that we needed silver, but people would come to the house expecting to see Revere silver. So we kind of made the unwritten rule, Nina and I, that we would always have Revere silver on display, no matter what display I had in the little case in the house. And so we since then have built a modest collection of Revere silver. And in terms of, if there was anything we'd want more of, I would say Revere silver. Revere silver or personal objects, because we don't have a bowl, we don't have a teapot. Surprisingly, Revere didn't make that many teapots. He made two or 3,000 spoons, but not a lot of teapots. But when we acquired the building behind the Revere House in 2007, one of our goals was to have exhibition space so that we could show things that we can't show in the Revere House. So the two small cases in the Revere House, we closed one, left one open, and we have now exhibition space in 56 Lathrop Place, in addition to offices. And we have one room that has cases that we will have changing exhibits. Right now, there's an exhibit in there about Revere's businesses. And we also have a case in that room that is only silver. So now we have a place to display Revere silver. If visitors want to see Revere silver, we do have, most of what we own on display. And we also have a permanent Midnight Ride exhibition downstairs. So we have, panels talking about, where Revere went at what time, quotes from history accounts, and a large exhibit case there where I can rotate in and out this Revere memorabilia I mentioned. We do have, the goal of exhibiting things from our collection, and the 56 Lathrop Place gives us the greater opportunity to do that. The building was opened in December of 2016 and has not been open during the COVID pandemic, but hopefully we'll get that open as soon as we can.
Yeah. And, I just wanted to mention, because Katie was going to ask you to talk about your book, but every 3 years, there's a new Grand Master installed as the Grand Master of the Massachusetts Freemasons. So do you know about this bowl that they have, that they bring out, and it contains some of the hair of George Washington? And
Yes, it's a little caster. It's very small.
Right,
It's gold, in fact, and it has the lock of Washington's hair. Yes, that's a special thing.
right.
That,
And so you wrote this book. Tell us about this book, Paul Revere and Freemasonry.
well, when I was hired by the Paul Revere Memorial Association, I wasn't the curator at that time. And really, probably the functions that I serve here is more what I would now call collections manager, almost rather than curator. But I was a kind of a research and programs staff person. So the director at that time said there were a few topics that the Memorial Association, wanted research, that we could know more about. And one of them was Freemasonry. So I said, sure, I'll do that. Sounds interesting, and then as I looked into it, I had ended up being a pretty basic monograph going through Revere's career, what lodge he was in, when, what offices he held. He became a Freemason in 1760 when he was about 25, and he worked his way all the way up to Grand Master of Massachusetts in the 1790s. So it was something that he so enjoyed. It gave him opportunity for leadership. It put him in contact with people like Warren, who he may have met in that avenue. So we just, we wanted to know more about that story. So that's really why I ended up researching that. And I think it's important because it was very important to him.
Right.
You really do. William Bentley, I guess, who wrote a diary, he was from Salem, and he wrote about Revere. Colonel Revere enters into the spirit of it and enjoys it.
Yeah.
That was his comment about, Revere, as Grand Master. He just really, he went with the ritual, with the rules and regulations. He was on committees that dealt with that. He was on committees that dealt with the charity aspect of being a Freemason, where they would collect monies for, as it said in the minutes, for distressed brethren, for widows of Masons, and
Which they still do today.
they once said, so I think he wrote regulations for charity at some point. There were a couple of Masonic documents like that he wrote that are probably mainly in either the collection at the Grand Lodge, which now also the National Heritage Museum has probably some of those items also.
So
Right.
as the longtime guardian of all of these treasures, Edith, how has the role of being a curator changed throughout your tenure at the site?
It hasn't changed that much, I have to say, in the sense that our focus is still the same. One of the large goals of the Memorial Association is to preserve the house, interpret the house, the neighborhood, the Revere's, urban life, and all of those things that we're able to kind of do in the house. Record keeping, collecting these objects. I mean, that kind of has been the drill from the beginning. What has changed is, when the internet came in, for example, we would get more inquiries from people saying, I have this copper pot that says Paul Revere 1801 on the bottom. And of course it's Revereware, but they would say, was it made by Revere? We got, that opened up. I mean, not that we didn't get inquiries before. People would phone us or send a photo, but we got much more of that. And Robert could speak to that too, in terms of research inquiries, and collection inquiries go to me, and object inquiries and research inquiries go in Robert's box. And also the job would change depending on what project we were involved in. When we were doing our exhibit for the Paul Revere Artisan, Businessman, and Patriot, we were picking objects, writing labels, and that was a fairly intensive project. It took some time, as did designing the exhibits for this new building. When we were involved in that, that was really the project of the moment. And that was what I spent a lot of time doing. I mean, in addition to maybe being in the house talking to visitors or being in the ticket booth, letting people in to see the house. So, it's kind of a mixed bag of what we do in the course of a day. But that's mainly the way it's changed, is just sort of, you go with the flow, and different projects come to the fore at different times. And that has made the job, fairly variable.
Right. It's, we were excited about having you on. It's been such a pleasure. I'm stunned at some of the stories you've told us, from the keys to the cigarettes and the lost letters. So really, we're really looking forward to the time that we can get back in when the museum opens up and we can visit you and maybe get a behind the scenes tour.
Oh, that would be great. Yes, I'd be very pleased to do that.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm excited. Edith, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today. My name is Katie Turner Getty, and on behalf of my colleague, Christian Despina, and myself, thank you for watching. We will see you next time.